Unsiloed podcast is produced by University FM, elevating the stories of your institution.
Welcome to Unsiloed. This is Greg LeBlanc, and I'm here today with Geoffrey Hodgson, who is a professor at Loughborough University and also the author of, countless books, some of which I have with me. I guess this one we'll talk about a lot is called Darwin's Conjecture, the search for general principles of social and economic evolution, followed up by From Pleasure Machines to Moral Communities, an evolutionary economics without Homo economicus. Some other books include How Economics Forgot History, Conceptualizing Capitalism, and the most recent book is called The Wealth of a Nation, Institutional Foundations of English Capitalism. Welcome, Geoffrey.
Thank you, Greg.
Well, look, I think in one of your books, you talk about how economics has tried over the years to develop a general theory, and sociology as well, coming up with general theories that can be used to more or less explain everything. And of course, the most famous example of this in economics is sort of the general equilibrium model of Arrow and De Brue, and you talk about how it ultimately founders on immense complexity. And so I guess it was in the 1980s where people kind of realized, hey, we need to kind of do something different. And that's where game theory came into the mix. And so for decades, economics was dominated by game theory. And you talk about some of the problems that game theory has as a general theory. And after pointing out the limitations of general theory in some of your other works, you talk about how Darwinism might provide sort of a unified theoretical framework. So I was wondering if you could talk a bit about sort of why is it that these attempts at general theory fail, and what is it about Darwinism that might allow it to become, if not a general theory, a unified theoretical framework?
Yeah, that's a great question, Greg. I'll try and answer it. The key point is that economics and the social sciences generally are different from something like physics. What physicists are trying to do is to understand general laws, and the laws are general because the universe is subject to general laws, and matter itself is subject to general laws and principles, and physicists are trying to understand matter and the universe and so on. So there's nothing wrong with general rules if your object of analysis is relatively similar in terms of, a proton is a proton here and there, and at time t and time t plus 1, they're all protons, and they can be analysed with similar principles. So a great example, of course, is Newton, with Newton's laws, and we know the limitations as you approach the speed of light with those laws, but they're pretty good for many things and calculating, and they're universal. We have to adjust with friction and so on, but the laws themselves are central to the endeavour to try and understand those phenomena. What's different both in biology and in the social science is that the object is changing. Okay, if we want to look at human evolution, the principles and ideas and the circumstances and mechanisms involved may be different from plant evolution. A modern society based on markets may operate in very different ways from an old tribal society or an early civilization or something like that. History gives us creates change and creates new institutions and structures which may require additional principles to understand. In human innovations like property, certain key institutions, legal institutions, for example, states, money, all these things that we take for granted have not existed for all time. So we have this combination of things which are really existed for a long time, like human nature hasn't changed an enormous amount. Culture has, in that respect we do change, but the basics of human nature, our need for certain vitamins and other things, and for comfort and warmth and the comfort of mothers and so on, cooperation, all those things matter and have mattered for millions of years, and we can find those things in the primates, for example. But the other things, which are more historical, the changes we've seen in the last 10,000 years or even 200 years, are enormous and may require additional principles. My argument in several places, including in that book Darwin's Conjecture, which you kindly raised up, is that the Darwinian framework, because it applies to biology and because you have this similar problem of one theory not fitting everything and different phenomena, provides a general guidance on how we as economists or social scientists might wish to think about these things. So it's not as if generality is always wrong, it's the generality often has to be supplemented by particular ideas and analyses. So institutional analysis, institutions are generally important. Institutions are basically rules. Primate bands have rules, as certain people have observed. Primatologists done experiments and observed chimpanzees in the wild and found that there's rules going on. Rules are general, but the particular rules are very different, and they're much more highly developed in complex ways in human societies, particularly in modern human societies. So if we take an historical approach, we try and categorize what's important, and it doesn't mean we load the theory with everything, but we take key transitions which are very important. One which I think is very, very important to understand, and which is still controversial, and that is the transition from a tribal society to a society with states and markets. We have trade earlier, by the way, but I mean organised markets with property rights and laws governing ownership and relationships between people of other kinds. That is a huge transition, and it occurred in different ways and to different degrees. But we're basically looking at a few thousand years of history. And we have other transitions coming later, including the need to explain the massive increase in productive resources we see in the last 200 years or 300 years in human societies. Even in the less developed world, they've got richer. I mean, I'm not forgiving and not ignoring the state of poverty that still exists in the world, but this transition in human society is huge. Human longevity is much longer. Now, these are very, very important transitions. Why have they occurred? Well, I don't think they occurred because of random events. I think they occurred because of new institutions and new frameworks and new things going on which didn't appear before. New ideas as well, of course, are important. So we have to focus on both of those, the general drift and the general arrangement of history, and also the particularities.
Well, look, when Darwin came up with his framework, I mean, it was absolutely transformational and forced people to rethink everything. And I think almost immediately people started to apply it to social phenomenon, right? To apply it to not just nature, but to culture. I mean, but then people kind of backed off of that. I mean, partly because I think of the Mendelian kind of addendum to Darwinism, but also because people were, I guess, reacting to what was perceived as the negative consequences of social Darwinism. So there was a period where Darwin really didn't have anything to say to social scientists. So why did that happen? And why did it ultimately why did kind of Darwin start to kind of creep back into the social sciences?
Well, you opened a hornet's nest there, Greg. There's an enormous number of important issues involved there. I'll try and answer as some of them. It's a really fascinating question. I mean, first of all, let's look at Darwin's progress within biology and within the natural sciences. His theory was the controversy that was surrounded his theory when he published The Origin of Species in 1859 was primarily about one issue. It was primarily about, are humans descended from apes? And of course this offends a lot of religious people even today. They can't get their head around this possibility that we may be descended from apes. And But he made that very covert. It's not actually explicitly argued, but everyone knew this was the big idea and the big challenge to establish religion and other attitudes. And this became controversial. His core ideas of selection and variation and inheritance of characteristics were the mechanisms which I think are just as important, if not more important, scientifically, were relatively neglected, relatively sidelined, and much of the controversy was about, are we descended from apes or not? Actually, in my country, in Britain, the church got persuaded pretty quickly. I think it took a bit longer for. Still is a process, a work in progress, I think, in your country, but that's another matter. So amongst scientists, the scientific core of Darwin was not fully appreciated early on. And actually another guy was just as important, if not more important at the time, and that's Herbert Spencer, another Brit. But he was very popular in the United States. He was copious in his publications, and he was much followed. And he's a bit like Friedrich Hayek. Whether we like or dislike Friedrich Hayek's politics, Spencer was very similar, and like Hayek, a very inquisitive mind and trying to pursue ideas logically in his writing. And Spencer was more popular. So Spencer got muddled with Darwin in some senses. So the ultra-individualism, what we find both in Hayek and in Spencer, became some of the implied message of Darwinism, and that really created a problem. And Darwinism, again, even in science, even in the natural sciences, was a bit sidelined for a while, partly because of Spencer. Then Spencer went out of fashion, but it wasn't until the great synthesis, which is sometimes called that, between genetics and Darwinian principles occurred, or was established fully, which is round about the 1930s, that Darwinism just took off. And then you had the discovery of DNA, which gave the whole thing a huge boost by Crick and Watson in 1953. And that turned the corner for Darwinism. That made Darwinism, people said, well, we must take this seriously. It's not just a fantasy by a Victorian gentleman about descending from apes. There's much more to it than this, and we've got mechanisms and we've got things to test. And so after the 53 discovery of DNA and other things happening, Darwinism became much more respectable. But by this time, the social scientists had said, well, we're really worried about it. And then I just published an article this week on this, on social Darwinism. It's called Social Darwinism Revisited. If you can Google that, I won't say anything more about it. But it goes through this story. And using bibliometric evidence. So early on, this notion of social Darwinism was low-key. It was a few people, largely foreigners, largely non-English speakers, in French and Italian, talking about the Darwinism social or whatever. And they were associating it very much with conflict. There were critics, and they said that these nasty things happening in the First World War, conflict between people, racial connotations, racism, and notions that one race is superior over another. All these things that we rightly criticise were present then, and of course they're present in the Second World War as well. And that was what these people were saying, well, that's social Darwinism, we don't like that. And quite rightly saying they didn't like it, but they're using that label. But the label wasn't very much used. What turned it around about 1940 was the label started being used by people who were actually more critical, not just of racism, eugenics and other things, but of individualism. So it became a leftist kind of slogan. And then it took off, particularly with a book by Hofstadter, Richard Hofstadter, the great American historian, who originally was a communist. So when he wrote that book, he was affiliated, or just left actually, the Communist Party of the United States. But he was worried about individualism. And the Second World War, the events that led to it, and the alliance eventually between the West, the US, UK, France, and the USSR, Russia, Soviet Union, cemented this vision that they were really going against individualism. The capitalist society had been shown, according to them, to be feeble and prone to collapse, as it did in the 30s. They had no faith in that system, and also they saw individualism as a problem. Consequently, this term exploded, and it's acted as a barrier amongst social scientists for thinking about the things I raised earlier. The point, in answer to your question about general theory, particular theory, using Darwin as a framework, very cautiously and carefully, to understand change, to understand evolution, new forms, new complex organizations, and so on. It's really inhibited that kind of discourse. And this worried me a lot. I got interested in this question, I guess, in the 1990s, and I did a book on economics and evolution. But I was aware constantly of these barriers. So we don't want to go there. We don't want to discuss that. And it's still a big problem. There's also another set of problems, is that this kind of thinking is multidisciplinary. You need some knowledge of biology. You need some knowledge of the philosophy of biology. You need some knowledge of history. You need some knowledge of economics. You need some knowledge of sociology, etc. It's really a multidisciplinary thing, getting a handle on a set of ideas and sort of relating them together. And that, unfortunately, is not really encouraged in academia today. What's encouraged is specialism. You specialize, and specialism is very good in its own way, because by specialization and pooling resources on one particular problem, you make important advances. But also there should be a role in academia for synthesis, so people look at different ideas and bring things together. And I often the latter are disadvantaged by the system because of all this focus on publishing in a particular top journal which specializes in a particular kind of question and not using things from other domains. So that's also a complaint about academia. So I think these two big reasons have inhibited this potentially revolutionary transformation of the social sciences with the help of Darwinian principles. I'm not just saying this alone. There's several good friends of mine and others who say something similar, but unfortunately, we are a tiny minority.
Well, look, I mean, even a casual observation of social phenomenon will lead you to see variety, inheritance, and selection. I mean, I was just reading Hume recently, and he talks about, right, the imperfect transmission of texts, right, through time. And so, yeah. I mean, I think people in the law understand this, particularly students of the common law. They see, mutation, yeah. They see retention over time and selection. And so was economics sort of late to the game just because it focuses on equilibrium phenomenon? Yeah. Or is it because they didn't really have the tools and the language? I mean, I think what you mentioned, it was like Alkian and Hayek, yeah, and a couple others who started introducing these. I guess, I mean, you talk about Schumpeter. Schumpeter also introduced ideas of disequilibrium. I mean, did we need to sort of abandon the notion of equilibrium to do this? Because biologists also use equilibrium in their models.
Sure, yeah. There are local equilibria, obviously, all the time in biological phenomena. But disrupting that and talking about qualitative change has proved difficult for many economists, but partly because of the intellectual framework, which we might call neoclassical economics, which focuses on utility maximization and equilibria, is still dominant in the discipline. But I'm not entirely pessimistic. Despite that problem, there's perennial dissent and perennial innovation going on in economics, trying to get out of those boxes. Of course, one's frustrated if one thinks like me about the progress, but on the other hand, there is constant critique and development. The names you mentioned, of course, Schumpeter, Hayek, and so on, are very important in that regard. The problem really, I think, for economics is that it's really like sociology to a similar degree. They've abandoned big theory. Big theory is less popular. I mean, in economics, mathematical theory is very popular. In fact, it's a necessity to publish in some journals to build a model. You have to do that to get published. But the idea of thinking back on what the assumptions are and sort of a semi-philosophical discussion about basic assumptions and thinking about alternative big theories is not encouraged. It's not encouraged in economics for various reasons, and for slightly different reasons, it's not encouraged in sociology either. So again, it's the structure of academia and the way we teach students and the way we replicate our ideas and our systems of ideas through time that's part of the problem. And it's not easy to change this.
Well, look, I find when I speak to business people that they're very receptive to evolutionary analogies, right, or metaphors. But it usually stops at the level of a metaphor, right? So you talk about fitness landscapes, and even I think Nelson and Winter, right? I mean, they're not very precise about what the replicators are and what the interactors are, and I think is it really, is the problem with the further generation of this theory a lack of precision? Do people in the business world, in the strategy world, in the economics world, just sort of end when they get to the metaphor rather than thinking carefully about how you would map over the Darwinian insights into economic and social phenomenon?
Yeah, it's like what you say, Greg. But I mean, precision isn't everything. It's important. I would emphasize conceptual precision, because often when people say we need more precision, they go off and try and build a mathematical model, but then they sort of assume out some of the problems and difficulties that were there at the beginning, that the discussion about what should be done in terms of research are ruled out. And I'm not against also heavy empirical work, because being precise about words is not everything. Mathematical models is not everything. And getting data and understanding what's going on is very important. And there's great work being done in that area. I mean, social science is lively in the sense it's constantly finding new material, new ideas, and new correlations between different sets of variables and so on in the real world, and that's fascinating for that reason. I mean, I give my tribute to Nelson and Winter, because in their 1982 book, Evolutionary Theory of Economic Change, they really did make a huge impact across multiple disciplines, including, as you say, in business schools and in management studies and so on. And that impact lasts to this day. I think part of the problem is that for different reasons, US and UK business schools are less concerned about developing new paradigms, more about immediate payback in terms of understanding business problems. I'm not criticizing that, but that's the way it works. And I've lived the last 3 decades of my academic life in kind of business schools. And I retired a couple of years ago, and then my last job was in a kind of business school. It didn't call itself that, but it was. It was studying management. And that environment is much more conducive to my kind of thinking and ideas than elsewhere. And that's why I think it's important. And the influence of Nelson and Winter is also important. But somehow we've got to do more to make progress in this area.
Well, I mean, most people who have read Richard Dawkins, right, they get very excited when they encounter this notion of a meme, right? And I mean, that term has actually entered into the popular culture, right? I mean, meme stocks and memes on the internet and so forth. But it's a very imprecise concept, right? What exactly is a meme? I mean, the analogy is that it's like a building block of everything cultural, but it's a little imprecise. So how can
Absolutely.
I mean, the insight is very exciting,
sorry.
but how do we formalize that and actually start
Yeah.
to develop coherent theories?
Yeah, a lot of people have tried, Greg, to make that meme concept more precise, and that created big disputes and some retreat from that question. In my Darwin's Conjecture book, which I wrote with Geoffrey Hodgson, we talk about more precisely what we mean about what's being replicated, and basically because we see institutions and rules as central to human interaction and large and small scale organization. It's the replication of rule systems and institutions that's most important. So we discuss how those get replicated. Why do people use the same rules of language? You and I are both speaking English, and we're both bound, more or less bound by the rules of that language, pronunciation and grammar and so on. So why do we replicate those rules over millions or billions of people? And that's a story about selection, a story about evolutionary advantage and so on. But that's the process we have to get a tether on. That's the process we have to understand. So, and we, inspired by people like Thorstein Veblen and John Dewey, we talk about habits being underlying mechanisms for expression and retention of particular rules. And so a lot of interaction with people, both formally, the legal system, and informally in culture, even with rules that are not written down, involves us getting habituated to doing things in certain ways and reacting in certain other ways. So we look more specifically at that kind of mechanism. And Dawkins is a great writer, a very inspiring writer. I don't agree with some of the things he says, but give him credit. That book had a huge impact, The Selfish Gene. He doesn't go into that kind of detail, and that's what we tried to do. We tried to pin down this idea of cultural transmission and replication as in terms of rule systems and in terms of habitual dispositions by individuals, which are then become emergent and become routines within organizations and higher levels of operation and development. So I think that's rather than sort of arguing about definition of the meme, I think look more concretely at the psychological and organizational, legal and other cultural rule systems that are involved.
Right, so the habit is sort of the basic building block, but then these habits can come at different levels, right? They can be routines, they can be customs, they can be laws, right? They can be, and so those are the things that are being replicated. And then the things that are essentially doing the replication, right? The interactors, those are the sort of ever increasingly larger forms of social structures, institutions, and organizations.
Yeah, they have some relative cohesiveness, and they interact with each other, and sometimes there's rule transmission between them. Sometimes one group will decline and go out, another group will become more prosperous, and so on. By these different mechanisms, different rule systems go on. Hayek actually talks about this. I mean, Hayek is not just talking about individuals, but also the individual is important. We replicate from individual to individual. I mean, if you taught me something I didn't know, Greg, I'm sure you could. We would do it by an interactive process, and I would acquire the habit to do it. I mean, riding a bicycle or something like that would be a process of interaction, and I would then develop the habits. And as Veblen and Dewey and others also pointed out, is a lot of habits are built on instincts. So if you look at child development, for example, a newborn baby has certain instincts to certain respond to certain smells, a mother's breast and so on, move towards warmth, and by a gradual enculturation process, an interaction process with the parent, the child learns certain rules and learns to do certain things and make certain noises to engage and acquire what it's searching instinctively.
Well, I think in that book you also kind of create a whole parallel to John Maynard Smith's hierarchy, right, with the great transitions. So he focuses on the great transitions in the domain of biology for the most part, and you focus on the great transitions in the world of culture. And really these transitions are all about the transmission of information, right, at different levels.
Absolutely. Yes, different ways of storing and transmitting information, different kinds of information. So, for example, the transition to a legal system from moving away from simple cultural law, cultural rules, and with chiefs and so on, and an established legal system with a division of labour and courts and judiciaries and judgments and probably recorded laws as well. That is a huge transition, even though you can trace bits in the earlier forms. And law itself becomes a form of information and is transmitted and copied by other authorities as well.
Mm-hmm. And there's also presumably feedback between all these different levels, even so far as to have feedback at the genetic level, right? So we are evolving into a world where those levels of information transmission will be indispensable to us, right? I mean,
yes,
analogously, people will lose their ability to walk around without Google Maps, right? We lose our ability to make sense of the world without these institutions.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, some people argue that our memories aren't so good because we have so many ways of recording information now. And perhaps our intelligence will go when artificial intelligence takes over. I mean, I'm slightly fuller of this, but there is a challenge here that as machines and information technology takes over certain functions, it gives us others, BART and meta functions as well, but creates new opportunities, but also robs us of some of the capacities that we habitually use. So this is quite interesting and challenging, I think.
Mm-hmm. Now, I think it was in the book Conceptualizing Capitalism, you had a whole chapter on theory of the firm. And of course, in business schools, we're all interested in firms, right? And how firms work and how they sort of serve as retainers and transmitters of ways of doing things, right? They develop routines, they develop organizational structures, competitive advantages, ways of doing things, and so forth. To what extent does it make sense to think of a firm as a coherent entity rather than just simply as, I guess, a collection of individuals who are engaging in some contracts with each other?
Yeah, I think everyone's got the basic intuition that there's some kind of coherence in the firm. Of course, some firms are less coherent than others. Some firms are loose amalgams of people working together. Adam Smith has this idea of a pin factory, and he thinks, let's imagine everyone trading with each other at different stages of the pin production. That would be a very loose kind of firm. Conversely, Smith said, when you have employment in the firm, it would be a different matter. Coase used that dichotomy more extensively than Smith. Smith just simply hinted at it. He said it's about cooperation in the firm. But Coase, in his 1937 article, said this is a way of understanding what the firm is. So I think that the standard views on the firm, much as I respect and admire the contributions of Coase, Williamson, Alkin, Dempsey, and all these people on the firm, have not themselves satisfactorily answered this question of coherence. And the answer that myself and several others, we've been working together on this, we come up with this notion of the legal nature of the firm. In other words, it's the legal recognition of an entity which is more than an individual, bound together by legal rules. I mean, it could be his own rules, its articles of association, but these are subject to corporate law or partnership law, and therefore legally bonded, even if they're unique to that organisation itself. And the firm, therefore, possibly in a corporate form, acquiring legal personhood. And this glues the firm together, and we emphasise this, and sort of Coase almost goes there. Coase sort of hints this, but he never says it. Williamson explicitly rejects it. Williamson's a later writer, died a few years ago. And I think that's an important defect in his argument, notwithstanding his other important contributions. But I think that this does answer that question of coherence. But the reason I think Williamson in particular avoided that answer is because he was hung up on this general theory. So he wanted his theory to be true for all time, okay? Not just modern times with modern legal systems, but all time. And it's sort of basic to all human interaction, all productive human interaction when you produce things together. And our argument is really firms are historically specific. I mean, human cooperation in production is back to the primates. We've banded together and hunted things together, but they aren't necessarily firms in the sense that business school students understand firms or want to apply that knowledge to understanding how firms operate. So we do have teams and groups and hunting bands in different species, but the firm is something more. It's something long-lasting. It has mechanisms which means it can outlive the lives of everyone within it. All employees, all owners, all shareholders, it can all be outlived by the firm. And we have several firms which have literally existed for hundreds of years. And that's really important. Actually, in another name, Douglas North, he actually makes this point in his book on conflict and violence, which came out, I think, 2009, co-authored with Barry Weingast and John Wallace. This point is made very clearly that the corporate form is a major modern transition. So not everyone's hung up with this desire to have universal principles. And once we get rid of that hang-up, I think we can tackle the firm much more concretely. There's much more work to be done about using this legal framing to understand key business organizations.
Well, even though I don't think any of us want to find any kind of teleology in evolution, it does seem that we're seeing ever greater complexity. I mean, these layers of institutional sophistication seem to become ever greater over time, right? I mean, as you tell the story of the different transitions, I mean, they happen chronologically, right?
Yeah, and also incredibly, so far at least, at increasing pace. I mean, last 50 years, enormous amount technologically, in terms of human institutions, has happened. It's not all been an easy ride. I'm not trying to be to promote some kind of Whig view of history and everything going magnificently towards some perfection or whatever. No, it's not this, and it could be reversed. We could enter another much more disruptive period and regression with problems like climate change, for example. It's sort of warnings, there's writing on the wall, but those things apart, the achievement of humans as humans in terms of building layers of complexity and developing technology and innovating, it's astounding what we've achieved, not in a relatively short period of time. So go back 50 years, things were very, very different. Go back 100 years, things were very different. Go back to 300 years, enormously different. And it's amazing, I mean, how these complexities emerge, which does raise a theoretical question, which I look at with Geoffrey Hodgson in the Darwin's Conjecture book is how would we explain that? And actually, there's an argument you can use in biology. It's a rather technical argument, and it does rely on some kind of empirical, some agent-based modelling and that kind of issue. So it's not decisive, but you can actually make arguments about how complexity increases. And humans, for good or ill, have experienced this pace of evolution, which is, in institutional and cultural terms, much more rapid overall, with blips and setbacks, than any other species does. There are some instances where biological evolution is fairly rapid through feedback effects. Certain species, fruit flies, for example, mutate rather rapidly. But nothing like this story that we've seen about human endeavour over the last few hundred years. And I think that's something we need to get our heads around and try and explain it, or at least take it into account.
Well, one of the great discontinuities that we all love to talk about is the Industrial Revolution. And I think any great economist has to deal at some point in their life with the Industrial Revolution, and you take it on in The Wealth of a Nation. And it does seem as if this discontinuity coincides with the sixth great transition that you discuss, right? The sort of institutionalization of science and technology. And I think some others like Joel Mokyr would say that that was really the fundamental driver of this great change. But you also emphasize the importance of law and these legal institutions that are the building blocks of capitalism, especially financial capitalism. So how is it that economists have failed to appreciate the role of institutions? I mean, of course, there's a whole discipline called institutional economics, right? Doug North and Barry Weingast, of course, are very important in that area. But why is it that we sort of misunderstand capitalism and the institutional foundations for it?
Yeah, it's a great question. I think there's lots of facets to the answer. I mean, we must here give credit to Doug North in particular, who, as an economic historian, brought institutions in more than anybody else in the post-war period. There were people before, like in the German Historical School, American institutionalists, that did talk about the role of institutions in history, but North replaced it on the agenda and did an enormous amount of work. Now, so, I mean, I admired North's work enormously, and it's actually going through North's arguments and seeing the pluses and minuses as I saw them in his argument that actually was a huge stimulant for that book and for my interest in economic history generally. What eventually struck me is that he was right about emphasizing certain institutions, but he got some of the details wrong. Okay, my first focus was on the issue of property rights. So in the book I talk about the Glorious Revolution, which happened in 1688 in Britain, and a Dutch army arrived just over there, a few miles over there. I live in Devon. It arrived on the Devon coast, led by William of Orange. It went through the country. William eventually became king the following year, 1689, and this changed things dramatically in several ways. And North focuses on this. There were other events which are important, like the English Civil War and so on, but we can focus on this as an important event. But I think he got part of the story wrong. And the crucial part he got wrong was he talked about the security of property rights. So you have this issue of the balance of power between the monarch, the king or queen, and the parliament becoming more important through time. And one of the complaints of parliament was kings were always messing around. They weren't giving parliament its say, and they were dissolving parliament at will when they couldn't get their way with it. And this event, 1688, 1689, created a new balance of power between king and parliament. Not so much through rewriting the constitution, but because of the de facto arrangements between them. In particular, Parliament endorsing William as monarch, quite unusual that Parliament has that role of creating the monarch. It's normally inheritance rules that do that for you in a monarchical system. But that's one reason amongst several why this new balance between Parliament and the sovereign stuck and became important. The North was right to emphasise those events, and he was right to emphasise that particular new arrangement, which has some novelty to it. But he was wrong to focus on the issue of property rights, because as several people have pointed out, that property rights are actually relatively secure in medieval England. Okay? I'm not saying it was a legal wonderland where everything was, secure. It wasn't. You got robbed and people got beat up and killed and all the rest of it. And if there's a civil war and you chose the wrong side, you didn't only lose your head, you lost your property and your family lost it as well. It's a big deal, a lot went on. But even in times of civil war, we can see this in the Paston Papers, people could go to law and make complaints about property and re-establish their property rights or secure them in certain ways, because feudal law was quite effective since Henry II, basically, shortly after the 1060 invasion. So by lack of judgment, we created a relatively robust system of law which could deal with things like property transactions for the rich. For the poor, it was a different matter, but for the rich, that was it. So what needed to happen was to make property collateralizable, to make it usable as finance, so that people could borrow and they could improve their land, they could invest in a new agricultural equipment, and maybe the local canal and eventually the local railway and so on. And that wasn't there. And I spent years working on that problem and looking at people. Some people have noticed this and relatively little attention given to it. I was driven in that direction by my understanding about the nature of property. I'd done research on it before. And I came up with this new argument that actually what's crucial is a transformation of these rights. And how are these transformed? They're transformed partly through conflict and struggle, but are always expressed, at least in the British case, through legal changes. And some occurred in the 17th century, but many more occurred later, including the enclosures in the latter half of the 18th century. So law for me then became a way of tracing these fundamental transformations in property rights through time. And I built this out with the help of others and created a new narrative. So it actually is a narrative of institutional change. So North has rightly pointed to the institutions, but I give it more substance and correlate that with legal changes in the system. And actually use legal data. There's some great work done by some American colleagues, Peter Merrill and John Grau, which has got huge amounts of data by using search engines on legal documents, and shown these changes. I mean, empirically it's becoming very exciting. So I related that story, and it was key. I was always persuaded by Schumpeter's argument that finance was central to capitalism, but I never saw it as graphically expressed as in this kind of data and in looking at the legal text and seeing what changes had gone on. And so I wrote it in that way. And it's a more complicated story because there were problems all the way down. But you can illustrate it both by these data collection methods and also by case studies, like you're looking at Boulton and Watt, who developed the steam engine, which became not the original version, but developed a version of the steam engine, which was crucial in the Industrial Revolution from about 1775 onwards, and led in turn to the steam engines and railways and so on. And there's other parts of the story. There's what about slavery. Slavery, for example, is very important in the British case. Sadly, I emphasise the scale of slavery, but you emphasise also, as some other economic historians have also done, that slaves is not simply the enslavement of labour, it's actually the creation of human collateral. So when I can mortgage my house to raise money if I want to invest in something or use it to for expensive luxuries or whatever I want to. I can get a mortgage, but you can get a mortgage also on a slave. And that was well known. It was a phenomenon. So it's a degrading phenomenon, doubly degrading, because you're treating humans like they are machines and objects which are usable as collateral. But that's what people did. It was quite common. So it wasn't just getting profits from the slave trade, which people did to invest in it. It was also using humans as collateral. So this issue of collateral and the development of collateralization in the system, which is relatively recent, it's in the late 17th century through into the 18th and 19th centuries, that it becomes important. And it coincides with the Industrial Revolution. So I hope that argument has an impact. It's an eclectic argument which has drawn on others, but I hope in the way I've expressed it, it makes sense to people.
So the idea is that, I mean, finance had existed for a long time. I mean, there were merchants from Genoa and Florence, but that was mostly trade finance. It was mostly bills of exchange, I guess, real bills, that sort of thing. It wasn't actually financing real property or collateral. It wasn't secured by some long-lived asset. Is that the key difference?
Yeah, to a limited extent, people would lend on the basis of some collateral, but the market, the collateral, there were mortgages. Mortgage is an old word. I mean, the pawnbroker's shop, they had pawnbroker shops in ancient Rome. So you had a gold ring or something, you could put it in and that's a form of collateralization. You deposit the ring, a bit of gold, you get the money out, and then you either repay it and get the gold back, or you use the money and you don't. And so the collateralization is also a very old concept, but it's underdeveloped. I mean, the two key things that happen is the development of a state bank, and of course I must hesitate here because the Americans are very slow in developing a national banking system, a federal banking system. I mean, with the Fed being founded in the early 20th century, but other countries were way ahead. We had
the Bank of the U.S.
Yes, but there's a story there which is some scholars have made a very good account of. So it's a complicated glitch, but other countries like Britain, France, Sweden had quite early on had national banks. Belgium did as well. And the reason we did in 1694 form the Bank of England was to finance war. Okay, but eventually that institution was transformed into something which also supported the banking system more generally, with the private banks over the place. And so so national banks is a key modern development. And also alongside that, when you have more extensive collateralization of assets, you get markets for debt. So the first thing a bank does if I apply for my mortgage on my house, my bank very sensibly will say, well, there's a bit of a risk with this guy, a bit of a risk with anybody. We're going to parcel out these risks, and this is what happens in modern capitalism, in Wall Street and other places, so as to protect ourselves from this guy dying or defaulting or whatever. So you get markets for debt. So it's not a market for things, it's a market for promises. It's a market for IOUs. And these really are quite modern. Didn't get going until late 1600s in the UK. Were a bit around in the Netherlands earlier and one or two other places, but really took some time to get going. And they did require quite complicated legislation, which actually the common law courts didn't actually sort out properly. And so someone called Lord Mansfield, in the British case, in 1650s, had to sort all this mess out and make these markets work. And when they did, when commercial law developed in a modern sense, then those institutions became workable and expandable.
I think you quote somebody who said that one of the greatest inventions of the modern world was
Yes.
debt as a saleable commodity.
That's Henry Dunning MacLeod. Yeah. If we would name the person who made the most important invention, it was the creation of market, to realize that debt is a saleable commodity.
I forget, someone else said it was the invention of the limited liability corporation. I forget
That
who
was
that was.
later, yeah. That was I quote somewhere an editorial from the Economist magazine where they said, also the unnamed people who invented the limited liability corporation should have a statue, but we don't know who they are.
Mm-hmm.
We know who invented the modern, widespreadly used steam engine, James Watt, preceded by Thomas Newcomen, but we don't know who invented these institutions. They were done by committees. They were done iteratively through time. Yeah. So
Do you think that
these are important quotes.
do you think that this observation was late because people had a view of capital as something physical rather than something financial? I mean, you go through how Marx and others had this.
Yeah.
Yeah, and even
This
in
is a
sort
big
of
bugbear of mine. Yeah.
yeah, I mean, even in standard sort
Again,
of production functions, we think of capital as
yeah.
something
This
physical,
idea of
right?
a associative machine. You put stuff in, you wind the handle in it. You put
Yeah.
capital and labor in, and you wind the handle, and out comes an output. Yeah. Again, Schumpeter is key here because he said this is wrong. He says people are misusing the term capitalist. And if you ask a business person, this is all interesting about working in a business school. If you talk to business people, actual real business people, not people talking about business people, but real business people, and accountants, even academic accountants, they'll say capital is the money value of tangible and intangible assets, which are saleable. In other words, it's in the balance sheet of the individual or the company, and it's there, a list of assets, and these are potentially saleable, and they have a value. So who changed that? When it was actually Adam Smith who changed it, and in his Wealth of Nations, he just previously everyone or most people had used the word capital as business in money investment or monetizable investment. And then Smith said, well, it's just stuff. It's the things themselves that matter. Kind of a physical view of the world, inspired probably by Newton and the success of Newtonian science. And Smith was a great economist, but he got that wrong. And then later on, as you say, the production function and all this mathematical mechanics becomes important. And that obscures it. And it's a tricky thing. But there's several good people in the history of economics that have looked at it. Now, one of them in particular I looked at recently in more detail is Frank Fetter, who's an American. He was influenced by the American institutionalists in the early half of the 20th century and also by the so-called Austrian school. And he captured insights in both of them. So as well as Schumpeter, there's others. Weber actually said that the capital should be used in the business sense. And of course, when I wrote on this, I realized that economists are not going to quickly change on it, but it's very important to establish that there is something different. And in economic history, the two things are often conflated. You get sentences or paragraphs, more accurately, paragraphs where the meaning changes between the beginning and the end of the paragraph. The word capital is used 2 or 3 times, and at one stage it means physical things, at another stage it means finance, right? And those are different. Capital goods are not the same as finance, and that's obscured or confused this kind of discussion. And at least for the purposes of understanding economic history, we need to separate those two concepts.
Well, I mean, in your work, you talk about going from the general to the specific and the specific back to the general. I mean, historians oftentimes focus on the specific while social scientists focus on the general. So when you actually did this work of history, I mean, it's easy to get lost in the particular. But then towards the end of the book, you say, hey, Darwinism provides a wonderful framework for understanding things. But it's not immediately obvious when reading the book how the Darwinian insights have shaped your inquiry in the subject. Could you just talk briefly?
Yeah.
How did a Darwinian perspective help you to see things when you were studying the Industrial Revolution that you think others might have overlooked?
Maybe that's a bit critical, but I think I kind of acknowledge the criticism that actually I may have been trying to conflate two issues. I ultimately persuaded to put the Darwinian arguments in, partly because of dialogues I've had with John McKeer, who you mentioned, and also other historians like Deirdre McCloskey. Deirdre McCloskey, I've known her for years. We disagree on many things, agree on some, of course, and some which are very important. But she puts all the emphasis on ideas, and what I was trying to unpack is, what does that mean? Okay, ideas are important. How do people come to express particular ideas? And it's these undercurrents of change and shocks and impacts on the system causing people to face certain problems to which they try and devise solutions, successfully or unsuccessfully. And then often expressing the solutions in terms of an ideology or a religion. And so religion is quite important in this period we're talking about, the struggle between Catholicism and Protestantism, and then nonconformist Protestantism and so on. All these movements are very important, they're quite critical, particularly in the English Civil War in the 1640s. But I see that as a kind of down the line idea, that it was the problems, it was the shocks, the difficulties that led people to try and search for solutions, successfully or unsuccessfully, and they express this in certain ways. So they might come to the idea that we needed more trade, or we need to expand trade, or whatever, and so free market ideas grew up and so on, and they would correspond to certain aspects of, say, Protestant religion. But it was the problems originally of having an expanding market for wool or whatever it might be that led people to think in those terms, and down the line certain concepts and ideas and religious background ideas and so on became important. But I'm trying to respond there to some extent to John McKeer, but more acutely to Deirdre McCloskey, and not putting ideas as the driver of change as such. Changes in ideas are the expressions of other changes behind them, I think.
Well, last question.
But
Economic history is sort of a... What's that? Sorry. Last question. Economic history is kind of... in some ways, it's a discipline without a home. It's unclear where it belongs and where it's headed. Does economic history need more theory? Does it need more organizing principles to maybe help it develop as a discipline?
I don't think there's a shortage of theory around in economic history. Different points of view on what kind of theory you choose and how you would apply it. But there's for example, there's a minority of economic historians which I think are too slavish to mainstream economic ideas uncritically, and that distorts their view of what should be sought for and understood and looked at and empirically examined and so on. But that's going to happen in any discipline. That's not an unusual thing that people go for orthodox explanations, not necessarily wrong either. But there is space for different interpretations, because one of the big advantages of both economic history and also business economics is ultimately there's some kind of test of what the relevance of what you're talking about. So when you teach business economics to MBA students, they want to know, is it relevant for me in the real world? I want to pass your exam and I want to learn these principles, but what's the relevance? How does it tell me to be a better manager, a better business administrator? And that's a very good question. And likewise, an economic historian, even called an economist, would still say, well, what's the payoff? What are you trying to explain? How does it help me understand X and Y and Z? And how does it improve on other explanations of X and Y and Z? So there's a kind of engagement in both of those fields which I find very refreshing and valuable. And so it's not the absence of particular theory. I think it's the scope for development of different theoretical branches within economic history which is important. I think the problem in economic history is it's not top status economics. So what top status economics is publications in the American Economic Review, which have a really beautiful mathematical model and prove certain theorems and influence others and generate a literature which tries different models and tests it, whatever. That's what was most prestigious. I mean, the grubbing about in the past is okay, interesting, but we're not going to give that priority funding. At least some universities might say that. So it is the Cinderella of the discipline. Wrongly so, I think, and I think it's important to recognise it's one of the few test beds we have for different theories. I mean, like, for example, take a simple prevalent debate, planning versus markets. Do we favour an economy which is largely, has a lot of state regulation or even planning, or do we favour an economy where that's minimised to the ultra minimum and markets and free enterprise flourish? And there's shades in between. That's an old debate, but we can look at that in economic history. We can say, well, let's look at the performance of different kinds of economies. So we say, look at China, for example, and say, well, when it was completely state-run, it didn't, under Mao Zedong, it didn't do very well, did it? I mean, it did a few things positively, but awful famines and other things going on. And then Mao dies, and they experiment with markets, and China takes off. So that's a bit of simplistic bit of economic history, which tells a certain story that maybe markets have an important role. After all, whatever part you are on the political spectrum, and that should be recognised. Now, the simple story from economic history is an important lesson. And we can say what countries perform better according to certain indicators, both currently and historically. We can't predict the future, so it's currently and historically. And I would argue that by many indicators, the Nordic countries, and possibly the addition of Germany and others, perform pretty well. And Japan also has some positive features as well. So, depending exactly what question you ask, you get possible candidates from history which perform well. What do we learn from that? Then, well, let's see how these countries work. Well, perhaps a strong welfare state isn't too bad a thing after all. We have a strong market system, we have private ownership, but we also maybe need strong education systems, strong health systems, and so on, to make economies work better in a modern context. We can learn all that from economic history, and this is really very important. And it motivates a lot of economic historians that actually there's messages for today, there's messages for countries. And if my book is making some valid points about finance and collateral and so on, that applies to the developing world. Because in the developing world, those institutions are unfortunately quite underdeveloped in many cases. And even in China, the finance is not sufficiently developed in my view. So there's lessons here. I mean, saying exactly how you deal with those problems is a different matter, but you're actually pointing in a particular direction and identifying key problems by looking at history. So I think history generally is a huge resource for all the social sciences, and particularly economic history.
You know, one of the things that you said in this book from 20 years ago is that even those who have abandoned the sort of general equilibrium model, they've still retained their view of the Homo economicus. Right? And so in this book, From Pleasure Machines to Moral Communities, I think you're trying to channel Adam Smith and bring morality back in. But I think the behavioral economists would say that they are abandoning Homo economicus. Is there something that behavioral economics is missing?
Well, the behavioral economics was originally associated with, as you know, with Herbert Simon. got the Nobel Prize for his work, particularly on this area and also the firm. And he coined the term behavioral economics. And he was very critical of these core assumptions of Homo economicus, economic man, utility maximization, utility maximizing behavior, and so on, and saying it's much more complicated. And he had a background partly in psychology and brought those insights into it. And for a long time, Simon was well known and he was cited, but the behavioral economics as such didn't really take off. I mean, it wasn't really there. For the late 70s, Simon was well known by the late 70s. Through the 80s, it wasn't really well known. It really took off in the 1990s. And what happened is a number of colleagues, particularly after Simon's death, I think in the early 2000s, transformed the genre. They transformed it into saying, well, what we need to do is investigate the kind of problems that Simon pointed to, limited information, bounded rationality, and so on. But we'll see to what extent the old traditional models can deal with it. So you had the idea of deviations from the traditional model, but keeping the traditional model as the baseline. And interestingly, as that kind of view developed, it became quite defensive. We said, we're not going to criticize that. That's Holy Writ. I mean, that's why it's not theirs. Treated it as Holy Writ, but we're going to look at deviations from it. We're going to look about how people cope when things are slightly different. But we still leave that that utility maximizing agent at the center of the story. So I would actually not exaggerate the difference between the very important contribution of behavioral economics and the standard model. I don't think economics have really managed to get rid of it. And I've done some work on that using, again, bibliometrics, which is about the best tool we have. Maybe you should use artificial intelligence as well to do searches, but much cruder searches, searches using key terms indicate this is not declining. Maximization, utility maximization are still key concepts in core mainstream economics in the top journals. And an old friend of mine, David Collender, he used to say, well, these things are declining, and I was originally quite interested in that argument, but I've come to a view that he was wrong. I told him so, and we're still friends afterwards, but we discussed that, and I think that's a problem. That behavioral economics has not had the more radical impact that some people expected at the beginning.
Well, Geoffrey, thank you so much for joining me. If you're interested in economic theory, if you're interested in economic history, if you're interested in evolution, if you're interested in, institutional economics, pretty much anything, you might want to check out the work of Geoffrey Hodgson. Thanks so much for joining me.
Thanks very much, Greg.
Unsiloed podcast is produced by University FM, elevating the stories of your institution.